Pan-African Shield. How Traoré and Putin might redraw the map of the world. Have you ever imagined that one day the story of Africa might no longer be written in Paris, Washington, or London, but begin in a quiet room in Bamako? A room with no United Nations flags, no foreign advisors standing in the background. Just three men. One from Burkina Faso, still young, one with a Russian passport but not a diplomat, and the third silent throughout the entire meeting. But he was the first to pick up the pen. Together they signed a document known only by its code name, Pan-African Shield. And in that moment a new alliance was born, not with missiles, but with quiet defiance, a refusal to keep playing by the old rules. Every day we hear about Africa through headlines of migration, poverty, or war. But rarely do we hear this, that this very continent is rising quietly, boldly, and rewriting the meaning of independence. Could a small country like Burkina Faso really lead a movement to push back against NATO's influence? Could a president under 40 reshape global politics with a new currency? And more importantly, if Africa chooses its own path, how will the rest of the world respond? Today we're stepping into a fictional scenario, but one that feels very close to reality. An African alliance emerges backed by Russia. And a war begins not with bombs, but with silence, sanctions, and strategy. A soft world war. Before we dive in, if you care about the truths that few people talk about, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss out on the small things that can truly transform how you see the world. And I want to know you're here with me. If this message resonates with you, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0. You might not realize it, but your simple comment could be the reason someone else pauses before believing another well-told lie. So now, imagine a world where Africa is no longer the victim, but the one rewriting the rules. Let's begin. Ouagadougou, 2022. The sun scorches the ground. Red dust clings to worn combat boots. And somewhere in a modest military camp north of the capital, a quiet revolution is taking shape. His name, Ibrahim Traoré. Born in 1988, raised in a land suspended between two worlds, a past of colonialism and a present of unstable independence. Caught between Western aid and a nation still hungry literally and figuratively for dignity. No Harvard scholarships, no polished political science degree from Sorbonne. Just a young officer in an old uniform carrying a stubborn belief that Burkina Faso deserves to speak in its own voice. When the country descended into chaos, when protesters flooded the streets angry at government corruption, rising terrorism, and foreign military presence, when hope was ground into dust between poverty and outside interference, Traoré stepped forward, not with a fiery speech, but with a short, calm announcement broadcast live on national television. We have taken over to preserve the very survival of our nation. He called it a rescue of sovereignty. The West called it a coup. But unlike the coups of the past, Traoré didn't reach for France, didn't appeal to NATO, didn't send envoys to the United Nations. Instead, he expelled French troops, tore up defense agreements, renegotiated the entire gold supply chain. And more than anything, he told his people, this country will no longer be a buffer zone. It will be a center. In Ouagadougou, people began waving Russian flags next to the Burkinabe tricolor. In Paris, editorials warned of the dangerous arrogance of a young military leader. But across Africa, especially the Sahel, a new ripple began to spread. Mali stood with Traoré. Niger declared support for financial sovereignty. Guinea withdrew from ECOWAS and proposed building a new bloc. And it was from these very real events that a scenario once thought fictional began to take form. A Pan-African alliance led by Burkina Faso, no longer reliant on the CFA franc, no longer asking permission from Paris, and for the first time ready to negotiate directly with Moscow, Beijing, even Tehran. March 2025. In a modest villa just outside Bamako, Mali, once a French colonial residence, a quiet meeting takes place among three men. No flags, no cameras, only hot mint tea stacks of thick folders tied with string, and an old map of Africa placed carefully at the center of the table. Ibrahim Traoré from Ouagadougou, Assimi Goïta, Mali's military leader, sitting across from him. And to their right, a silent Russian man known by many officially described as a military advisor, though everyone understands he's something more. The papers are laid out. There's no formal title. They simply refer to it by a codename Pan-African Shield. The plan is clear. No one reads it aloud. Each man already knows. Objective 1. Create an independent security bloc free from NATO, unconnected to the UN, with a joint command base in Niamey, Niger. Objective 2. Launch a regional payment system cutting reliance on the CFA franc and completely bypassing SWIFT. Objective 3. Build a media ring, a localized communications network that tells Africa's stories without relying on BBC, CNN, or France 24. But more important than any objective, nothing is to be announced for the first 12 months. They don't want the world to know. They want the world to feel a slow drift, a subtle fracture in the foundation of the old global order. Weeks later, the EU issues fresh sanctions targeting pro-Russian figures in Burkina Faso and Mali. The CIA quietly releases a report stating, an informal coalition appears to be forming, showing key characteristics of a Russian proxy alliance in West Africa. But by then it's too late. The oil routes from Libya through Niger have already been redirected south. China begins installing a new satellite station in Gao, and a young Burkinabe developer has quietly rolled out an open-source payment app called Sika, which 6 local banks have started piloting. No bullets, no warships, just one thing spreading the will to redraw every old map. And that more than any coup might be what truly terrifies the West. No bombs, no soldiers, no press conferences. The first response came not from a battlefield, but from a colder place, a financial control room in Brussels. 6 weeks after the Pan-African Shield quietly began to operate in the shadows, the European Commission rolled out Sanction Phase 1, freezing the personal bank accounts of 12 government officials from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, all held within the SWIFT banking system. In Paris, state TV aired headline specials titled, "The Dangerous Game of Africa's Young Leaders, Who's Pulling the Strings in Moscow?" On CNN, Burkina Faso accused of using Russian technology to control domestic media. This wasn't a loud retaliation, it was a slow-dripping poison. International payments in Ouagadougou began to glitch. Export transactions for agricultural goods were denied verification. Local startups saw their funding quietly dry up as Western investors pulled out. A young entrepreneur named Yakuba, creator of the mobile wallet app Sika, shared anonymously, "We couldn't buy new servers. No one blocked us directly, but our provider said we're outside the supported region." The West didn't strike with weapons. They struck with strategic silence. No one officially recognized the Pan-African Shield. But news outlets worldwide began to refer to it with a smirk. An alliance that doesn't exist. An illusion challenging the democratic world order, Russia's latest attempt to plant autocracy in Africa. At international economic summits, Burkina Faso's delegates were no longer invited to speak. Their foreign ministries' social accounts were labeled state-affiliated unreliable on Twitter. Facebook quietly took down pro-Shield posts for violating community standards. Meanwhile, Western NGOs pulled out of the Sahel citing staff safety concerns, but behind the scenes, it was calculated pressure. A soft, slow strategy of isolation, strangle the finances, let the chaos erupt from within. But there was one thing they hadn't expected. Traoré didn't respond with fiery speeches. No press statements, no pleas for help, no angry tweets. He remained silent. And in that silence, something unexpected happened. Thousands of young Burkinabe began learning to code. They gathered in cafes, tech schools, makeshift offices, and together they started building systems not dependent on Europe, not dependent on SWIFT, not dependent on approval. A former student in Mali said, "Now we see it. They don't hate us. They fear the one thing we're finally learning: self-sufficiency." As the old world launched a soft war, a new generation quietly laid the foundation for something stronger, built not with missiles, but with code servers and a spirit that refuses to kneel. And in the shadows of sanctions, a soft glow began to emerge, the belief that if no one tells Africa's story fairly, then Africa will tell it herself. No more direct attacks, no more troops, no more frozen bank accounts. The next counterstrike came from the most dangerous front of all: the human mind. It began with a short article in a French magazine seemingly neutral. It asked a simple question. Are rifts already forming within the Pan-African Shield leadership? No one paid much attention. A week later, a Twitter account named @VoiceFromGao leaked what it claimed was audio from a private meeting between Traoré and Goïta. In the clip, a voice speaking French and clearly angry says, "If Mali won't transfer command of the security structure to Burkina Faso, this alliance is a joke." The recording spread like wildfire. Unverified, but it instantly sparked division between Malians and Burkinabés. Hashtags like #StopTraoré, No to African Authoritarianism began trending on TikTok, Instagram, and WhatsApp platforms, where information moves faster than any traditional news outlet. In Niamey, Niger, home to the alliance's proposed security hub, small protests erupted. People demanded transparency within the leadership structure. Activist groups were split. Some accused Burkina Faso of manipulation. Others claimed it was Western psychological warfare. At the same time, popular African diaspora YouTubers based in the US and France began posting videos. Traoré is just dragging Africa into a new dependency, this time from Paris to Moscow. What's the difference? And with that, an invisible war officially began. Freedom Watch released a report accusing the Pan-African Shield of domestic media suppression and restricting youth expression. Several Burkinabe journalists were suddenly labeled Russian assets. Meanwhile, social media posts about the Sika project or rural coding programs stopped appearing in algorithm recommendations. Searching Pan-African Shield on Google. The top result wasn't local African media. It was a think tank from London with the headline, "The Delusion of African Sovereignty in the Age of Russian Interference." No bullets, but trust began to bleed. In Ouagadougou, a group of university students once passionate about building a sovereign tech future began arguing fiercely. Some dropped out of community projects, claiming they were being used by just another empire. Several grassroots organizations suspended operations due to lack of funding. For 3 weeks, Traoré made no public appearances. Rumors swirled that his own generals had sidelined him. Telegram groups circulated deepfakes showing Traoré in a Russian military uniform. But in that silence, something unexpected happened. A short video went viral, not from the government, not from any media outlet, but from a 16-year-old boy named Mamadou in a small village near Kaya. He filmed his coding class, just wooden chairs, beat-up laptops, shaky Wi-Fi. But every student focused, learning how to build apps without relying on European servers. In a trembling voice, Mamadou said, "We're not doing this for Putin, not against America. We're just learning to stand on our own. And if they fear that, maybe we're on the right track." September 2025. This time, the secret meeting doesn't take place in West Africa. It happens in an unexpected city, Asmara, the capital of Eritrea, a small nation isolated by the West. No IMF programs, no Starbucks, no press from Washington or Brussels. But it has what Traoré now needs: silence, space, and the freedom to build something bigger. Their representatives from 7 African nations sign a shared memorandum, no official title. But across African media, it's quickly dubbed the expansion. South Sudan, Central African Republic, Eritrea, Zimbabwe, and even an unofficial envoy from Ethiopia attend. Their reason is simple. We're tired of choosing sides in wars that are never ours. Like dominoes falling, lesser-known countries begin issuing quiet statements of technical and financial cooperation with Burkina Faso. International journalists start calling it a new multipolar bloc. In reality, it's a coalition of poor nations long burdened by international debt pressure and double standards, now finally turning to one another to learn how to stand on their own. In a rare public statement, President Traoré appears on a video call and says, "We are not against the West. We are simply choosing a different path, one where no one must pick between poverty and obedience." And that moment marks the first time the West is forced to respond publicly. France's foreign minister holds an emergency press conference, accusing foreign powers of orchestrating deep influence operations in Africa. The U.S. State Department issues a statement monitoring unusual developments across the Sahel and East Africa. The European Union convenes a special risk assessment committee focused on unregulated financial blocks. But the strongest reaction doesn't come from microphones. It comes from bank accounts. Several international banks based in Mauritius, Seychelles, and Kenya once seen as neutral hubs suddenly terminate relationships with clients linked to the Sika project and the Pan-African Shield ecosystem. Local fintech companies lose access to international card systems. Small investors are frozen out. Some entrepreneurs are denied visas simply for being connected to monitored entities. Western media begins to shift its tone from anti-CFA reformers to anti-Western bloc, from tech sovereignty advocates to a shadow network backed by Moscow and Beijing. CNN broadcasts a new map marking countries in red, not for war, but for non-compliance with Western economic norms. Most of them nations the world had rarely paid attention to until now. The world can no longer look away, because this quiet uprising is no longer a fringe idea born in Burkina Faso. It has become a wave. And as the wave pushes further inland, one question echoes louder than any headline. It may not be Moscow. It may not be Beijing. It may not even be Washington. It is the silence in the face of Africa's pain and its hunger for dignity that is redrawing the map of the world. Freedom is sacred. But in Africa, it has never been a gift. It has always been something to be traded, to be fought for. And the closer one gets to it, the more one realizes the true cost isn't the enemy outside. It's what you must give up inside. 3 months after the expansion, the Pan-African Shield is no longer a quiet idea. It has become a living system. The Sika financial network now operates in over 70 cities. Eritrea's satellite internet pilot quietly goes live. 3 cybersecurity training programs are held in Zimbabwe with instructors from Russia and Iran. The world is watching. The people are hopeful. But inside, a silent tremor begins to rumble. In South Sudan, generals reject plans to install joint surveillance hubs operated by Mali, citing sovereignty concerns. In Ethiopia, economists warn that a finance model outside SWIFT can't be trusted if still reliant on Russian-built code. In Niger, young engineers refuse to join a joint infrastructure project, calling it a repackaged Chinese Belt and Road. A leaked internal report quotes a high-ranking general, "If we replace one chain with another just in a different color, then we're not advancing. We're just shifting sideways." Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, doubt grows. Local radio shows begin asking uncomfortable questions. Is the president still leading, or is the military council running things behind the scenes? Independent journalists are quietly denied press credentials when investigating Russian-supported tech projects. One prominent columnist writes, "We had the courage to say no to Paris, but are we ready to say no to Moscow if we must?" And then something breaks. A battalion in northern Burkina Faso, trained under the alliance, takes control of a small military outpost. They don't fire shots. They don't demand regime change. They ask for one thing: transparency and the right to be heard. Traoré doesn't respond. No one knows where he is. For 3 days, government media remains silent. Rumors swirl that Traoré is being sidelined by his own generals for lacking the resolve to hold power. On the 4th day, a leaked telegram confirms the president is in Koudougou, alone. There in a modest room, no advisors, no security, just a desk, a map of Africa, and 2 plans on the table. Plan 1. Tighten media control, suspend protests for 6 months, establish a Supreme Alliance Council with executive coordination powers. Plan 2. Host a full transparency forum, invite free press, allow public questioning, and live stream the sessions. A soldier would choose the first. A true revolutionary doesn't choose easily. After 7 hours of silence, Traoré picks up his pen and writes a single line. Freedom doesn't have to be perfect, but if it can't survive disagreement, it isn't freedom, it's disguise. The next morning, Plan 2 is announced, and for the first time, the world is invited to hear Africa speak in its own voice. The modern world moves so fast that few still have the patience to listen to stories from places that aren't hot, strange, or strategically important. For decades, Africa only entered the global spotlight during crisis: a war, a famine, a desperate migration across a deadly sea. But in January 2026, under the dry Ouagadougou sun, the world paused. Not because of a bomb, not because of a coup, but because of something rare in modern politics: silence. That silence had a name: the Pan-African Transparency Forum. In the capital of Burkina Faso, at a wooden stage shaded by white canopies, there were no red carpets, no foreign envoys, no PR stunts. Just 200 journalists gathered from BBC, Al Jazeera, Washington Post, Reuters, to podcast hosts, freelance reporters from South Africa, Ghana, Rwanda, and even young students live streaming the event via TikTok on shaky Wi-Fi connections. What shocked them wasn't the setup, it was the tone, every question allowed, every criticism recorded, and no content filtered. When a French reporter stood up and asked President Traoré, "Do you admit that some mechanisms in your alliance mirror control models from Russia, and if so, how are you different from the regimes Africa once fought against?" The room went still. Traoré didn't deflect. He didn't give a rehearsed answer. He didn't blame. He looked straight into the camera and replied, "Yes, I admit it, and I'm correcting it." That answer didn't spark applause. It sparked silence, a kind of silence deeper than admiration. No branding, no sugar-coated speeches, no apology begging for forgiveness. Traoré didn't play the hero, he stood simply as a leader willing to confront his flaws in front of the world. And in an age where deception is polished, smoother than a well-trained AI, that alone was enough to make people believe again. After that forum, the tone in Western media changed. No more smirking skepticism, no more veiled condescension. New headlines emerged. Traoré, imperfect, honest, and possibly the most transparent leader of his generation. The Guardian. Africa's youth no longer seek sympathy. They're taking back their narrative. NPR. And most remarkably, The Economist, known for its cynical tone, released a rare special edition cover titled Africa's New Voice and Why the World Should Stop Speaking Over It. In cities like Bamako, Niamey, Khartoum, and Harare, a new identity quietly emerged: the Sika mindset. Young Africans no longer called themselves activists, revolutionaries, or tech founders. They called themselves Sika people, those who no longer defined themselves by Western acceptance, but by their own ability to stand, to learn, and to build. In rural schools, coding classes no longer trained students to apply for jobs at European firms. Instead, they created healthcare apps, financial tools, and educational platforms tailored for their own people, designed in local dialects, with real lived data. One viral clip from the Transparency Forum showed a young programmer from Eritrea speaking under the harsh sunlight. "I don't need to be called inspirational. I don't need praise. I just need the right to fail and the right to start again on my own soil." The video was shared millions of times. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. Because it said something millions had never been allowed to say in their own voices. This was not victory, not an ending, not a claim that Africa had done something grand. It was simply the moment the world, just for a moment, paused and listened without interrupting. And sometimes that is all it takes to begin a new chapter. No map stays the same forever, and no global order remains still when the silent begin to speak. The story of the Pan-African Shield did not end with a grand ceremony, nor did it close with some overwhelming victory. There were no flags waving triumphantly under the African sun, no anthems echoing across news broadcasts. It ended, or perhaps more truthfully, it began again with something far quieter. The eyes of an African child looking toward the future, not with fear, but with calm confidence. In the weeks following the Transparency Forum, if you walked through towns in Burkina Faso or Mali, you wouldn't feel the buzz of revolution anymore. There were no rallies, no fireworks. Instead, there was something deeper ripening. The people weren't shouting, they were asking questions, important ones. Do we really need to depend on the outside world? Why don't we teach children to code in their native languages? Can we build simple medical equipment ourselves? Humble questions, but questions that form the foundation of the most lasting revolutions. Among leadership circles, Traoré no longer stood as a glorified icon, and that in truth was the best thing. He didn't need to become the next Mandela, nor a Che Guevara for Africa. He just needed to fulfill his role, the one who opened the first door in a room long locked by foreign design. And now he had stepped back quietly into the work of building systems. No headlines, no podiums, just structure, resilience, and the one thing most young leaders forget to value: durability. The Pan-African Shield was far from perfect. Some member nations continued to argue, some pilot programs failed, and yes, internal and external forces still attempted to sabotage or divide. But this time, something was different. For the first time, Africa had the right to fail and not be labeled the failure of a continent. They had the right to restart, to adjust, to define for themselves who they wanted to be without waiting for someone else to say it first. At a modest internal conference held in South Sudan, a professor from Zimbabwe stood and said, "The fact that we are sitting here together, disagreeing, uncertain, that alone is something that has never happened before. And as long as we can still sit together, we still have hope." No applause followed, but everyone nodded. This story may never appear in Western textbooks. It might never trend on global platforms. But in Africa, it had already started to be told again. Through mothers teaching in their native tongue. Through young engineers wiring local intranet networks by hand. Through kids learning Python on cracked phones under mango trees. No one was calling it a revolution. But everyone knew it could no longer be undone. Because once a silenced people finds its voice, they don't go quiet again. And once a continent begins to connect, it does not accept being divided again. They no longer need permission to exist. They no longer wait for approval. They will write their own story as the next chapter of the world. Not all maps are drawn with ink. Some are etched with breath memory and longing. They contain no borders, no coordinates, just invisible fault lines. Between fear and hope. Between silence and voice, between who am I and who do I have the right to be. This story may seem like geopolitics from afar, Burkina Faso Traoré, a so-called Pan-African Shield. But listen closer. Strip away the headlines, the treaties, the balance of power jargon, and you'll find something else, a people trying to stand upright, and simply asking to be called by their real name. A coder in Bobo Dioulasso doesn't need to know what Swift is. He just knows it shouldn't take 72 hours to send money to his mother in the next village. A nurse in Kismayo doesn't need to study the IMF. She just knows the blood pressure monitor at her clinic broke 14 years ago, and no one knows how to fix it. A child in Asmara doesn't know NATO from fiction. But they know they want to read books in their mother tongue, not the language of a former colonizer. They don't need credentials. They don't need permission. They don't need a global audience. They just need someone to listen. And if no one will, they'll tell their own stories anyway. If you're still watching now, perhaps you felt something. Not because the plot was thrilling, but because it held up a mirror. How many times have you stayed silent because you felt too small? How many times have you waited for the right moment to be who you are? Africa's story won't answer those questions, but it reminds us. We all have the right to write the next chapter of ourselves. And if this touched you even for a breath, leave a comment. Type 1 if this resonated with you. 0 if it didn't. Because who knows, your simple comment may be the reason someone else dares to restart their life. Before you go, if you believe the world needs honest stories, if you believe the unheard deserve a voice, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, stay with us not because we have the perfect answers, but because we're searching for them, together. The world doesn't need a perfect Africa. It doesn't need a perfect you. It needs just one true story, one real voice. From someone willing to say, I am here, and I will no longer be silent.